Welcome to Inside the Director's Circle and this episode on Start With What? AQ, or as we know, Answer Intelligence. I'm Jason Langford-Brown, your host, founder of the Director's Circle, practicing business advisor and coaching psychologist. In this episode, we're going to share with you a recent interview where Dr. Brian Klabowski, professor at Chicago University and founder of AQ, interviewed me about our use of AQ as a practitioner and its application to various elements of business, including high-performing sales. I hope you find this episode useful. And just very quickly before we do that, remember this is just a snapshot of what happens within our business leader community. So if you want to get more involved or access further insights, visit directors-circle.com.
In terms of the agenda today, what I wanted to cover, I think consistent with my notes here, is when I talk about PDSI, sort of what worked. I think you made a note you want to talk about accreditation. And then the third thing was the start with what, into why. So with the number one and number three, maybe we cover those first, but let's start with PDSI. I guess maybe you could start by just talking about the engagement a little bit. Talk about, how they use the app. Just give me a little overview.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I suppose the engagement started in a wider context of needing to elevate the leadership capabilities of what they call their project directors, which are, I suppose, the most senior people in the business outside of the executive. So there's been a whole program of work going into helping them develop their leadership skills, helping them manage their people more effectively. And one of the big components of that was the need to be better at giving feedback and coaching their people. So a whole process was developed and put in place for performance management around the notion of coaching as opposed to old-fashioned appraisal processes. So they are, by definition, highly intelligent individuals. They're engineers/project managers, high IQ. I don't think if they're listening to this, I don't think they mind me saying maybe not as high EQ as maybe they need to have as leaders. And I think as a consequence of that, their communication wasn't always on the mark. So we really wanted to pick up the AQ element because we'd already done a lot of work on questioning as part of the coaching training. And it was like, okay, so now we need to get much slicker at knowing what questions we're answering and how to answer those questions ultimately for influence. So we decided to pick up the AQ app course as a way to really embed that initial knowledge, but also get them to start applying it into the day-to-day and get some momentum towards the outcome.
That's great. And in terms of the outcomes, can you comment on some outcomes that you think were achieved? How did they benefit from using the app?
Yeah, I think there's various outcomes at various levels. I think what was really positive for me was there was an immediate feedback from them in terms of how the conversations they were having with their people were improving almost instantly. And I think that was probably a combination of the coaching work we'd done with them, but also the AQ. But suddenly, we'd already seen, they'd already said that their conversations were better from the coaching approach. But I think once they then laid on top of that the AQ, they were really starting, I think, to start to see some more tangible outcomes from those conversations rather than just being nicer conversations. They were going to actually, we feel like we're making some progress and actually getting our messages across and getting some different action from our people. So that for me was a really positive kind of immediate impact. I think it then just kind of went deeper levels. They started to really got them thinking by using the app, because of course they were dipping into that every day. So that was really good. So it kept it front of mind. So that was for me really, really important. And it really again got them thinking and reflecting on the notion of AQ, but also on the conversations they were having, the results they were or weren't getting, where they were still struggling. So I think it really opened up some gaps for them. And I think that was interesting. I think the app really helped them understand where they were strong and where they were weak. And everybody in the team had different strengths and weaknesses, which is not surprising, but really put a spotlight on that. So that was really, really positive. What else? I think there was probably the other thing to say is there was for me a much wider impact in it. It ultimately went beyond the coaching. So it started to open up into all manner of their conversations around leadership, but also around customer management. So they started to very quickly identify that this just wasn't about coaching their people. It was about how they communicate with their teams generally, how they communicate with customers. So some of those challenges and conversations started to come into the discussion very quickly as well. So I think that there was a bigger impact than just the coaching, which I think was really positive as well. And I think, the key now is that it's really embedded a way of thinking and a process that's kind of common to them all. So it's a common language. They are talking about it. They are referencing back to it. They are sharing their experience with each other. So it looks like we've kind of embedded this as an ongoing journey for them, which is really great.
That's great. And with the AQ app, there's asynchronous content. An individual user can review each day to keep them on task, and then there's a weekly Basecamp session, a live session with the group. I wonder if you could share any insights from that live session. Did anything strike you as interesting, or were you surprised about, or any kind of benefits that accrued during those live sessions? Can you give us a little bit of a flavor of how those live sessions worked?
Yeah, I suppose for me as the facilitator, maybe not surprising, but I think pleased that there was so much conversation and debate, so that everybody, I think in their minds, they weren't really sure what they were going to do, and we came together at Basecamp and why it was relevant. But I saw very quickly that they had lots to discuss. There was lots of challenges they were facing, lots of successes that they'd seen as they'd gone through it. Okay. And I think they were, from their perspective, they were really, really pleased with how much they learned from each other. I mean, I think the big feedback was they really, really enjoyed being in a room, albeit virtually, as a group, and actually hearing each other's stories, because I think that really gave colour to their own journey, but also widened the conversation. So that was something that pretty much universally they all talked about.
That's great. Is there anything else, Jason, that you'd like to talk about? This PDSI case study that you think would be good from your perspective?
I think one of the key things for me with the AQ app is, I suppose, like lots of technology or lots of models in isolation, they are, they can be interesting, they can be fascinating, they can provoke thought, but they don't often drive much action. But for me, bringing the AQ app into the wider conversation of effective communication, and then having that AQ app journey over the course of the 4 to 6 weeks, really force them to implement the things we were talking about, force them to practice, make mistakes, learn, and really, effectively they all progress their communication style. I think for me that's really what it's all about. So there was actual progression and improvement in everybody in the room, regardless of the level they started from. So I think for me that's really what the AQ app is all about. It's about how you integrate that into the learning and then use that as a tool to actually physically implement and see some progression towards mastery of the communication skills.
That's perfect. Well said. Let's move on to start with what into why. Jason, you shared with me a very interesting observation. We're all very familiar with Simon Sinek's Start With Why. And in a conversation recently with you where you were talking about the idea of starting with what. That's pretty provocative in certain circles. I wonder if you could explain to me a little bit of the context for this starting with what. What exactly does that mean? I think it's very interesting.
Sure. I suppose just to give this some context, we use the Simon Sinek Start With Why a lot in our work. We use it a lot particularly in sales, and in that kind of how to get engaging messaging across, how to disturb the market. That inevitably then runs into sort of brand positioning. And I think as much as I absolutely believe in it, there were a couple of issues I struggled with it. I think one is, as ever with anything that's popular, the way it was badly applied in the market. And what do I mean by that? Simon Sinek sort of talks about the kind of, start with why in terms of that inner belief and purpose, which is great. But when you get into sort of that, the more granular level of communication, shall we say, like a salesperson talking to a potential client or a brand manager trying to get a message into the market, the why I think shifts dimension slightly, and it's not really your why, it's almost the why for them. So it's the outcome that you're going to achieve for them. So we started to see after a number of years of people using it badly in the market that when we did use it, people got very resistant to it, and they go, "Oh, we've seen this so many times, and it's like Kool-Aid that has run out now." And then I quickly realized that actually they were using it incorrectly. So we kind of repurposed that, which I think was kind of interesting to start with, and said, you need to think about the why for the customer, the why for the person that you want to affect with your message. And and then I think the next thing that I've always struggled with is that when you start with why, it kind of feels strange, which Simon Sinek does talk about. So, I had a very personal example with it in the early days where, what was I was a coach. I was a coaching psychologist. I was a business advisor. If I was an accountant, I could go into a room and say I'm an accountant. I absolutely recognize that those are uninspiring words that, people, we're not going to inspire people to want to know more about you. But if I said something like, okay, someone said to me, what do you do, Jason? I said something like, well, I help people become more successful. When you kind of say it, it kind of feels almost like cheesy on the inside. You kind of go, kind of just, but so I tested it. I did test it. And this is why I believe in the start with why, before I come on to the start with what, is that when I did it, and as I said to somebody in a very high profile room, when they asked me what I did, I said, I help people become more successful. They physically grabbed me and said, wow, you need to tell me how you do that. Mm-hmm. So I go, okay, so it does work. I get the science, I get the biology or the psychology of it, whatever you want to say. Yeah. But when you just generalize it out there, it still is left with no context. I think the problem with it is generally it's kind of like you talk about what you're going to do for somebody as an outcome, the why for them, and it has no context. So, and I've seen lots of clients really struggle to really cut through with start with why on its own. So I think working with you on the AQ got me thinking about the what, which is I always call the so what. But if you bring the what back and say, actually, if you start with what, but you always link it to the why, suddenly the why is there up front and center, but it has context. So it's now, bland example, I'm an accountant that helps my clients become more wealthy. Suddenly that makes sense. It's like, I understand what an accountant is. There's a concept there. There's there's something I can comprehend, but it's linked to what you're going to do for me. And I think that's much more powerful than why on its own. I think the risk with why on its own is it may sound exciting. It may be something I want, but I kind of don't really, it's like almost like, but I still don't know what you are. I can't put you in I think people kind of almost want to put you in a box. So we've done a number of experiments, for want of a better word, with some of our more forgiving clients and tested the notion. And we've done it with clients that we've done why with many times before as well. And it's had a profound effect on what they've outputted and how actually their people have embraced it. Suddenly even their people are going, okay, this makes sense to me now. So I am a cost saving specialist that does this. Great. But when I just had to go out and say, I do this, it kind of felt weird because at the end of the day, I am that. So how can I not say I'm that? So I suppose this is a long answer to your question, Brian, but I think ultimately what we've come to is you've got to start with what, but you've got to link it to the why. But the minute you detach the why, the what does become a so what very, very quickly. But the why on its own can work, can be powerful, but it also can be a little bit nebulous because it has no context.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to play back some ideas that you just shared and sort of add some wrinkles and tell me what you think about it. So first, I love this idea of so what. The what question's a concept. So what? So you benefit the client by increasing performance or job satisfaction or some kind of outcome. That's a concept. And then in AQ terms, the why question is sort of cause and effect. So if the so what is you increase performance as a leader, the why question is the strategy or theory. Your leadership leads to performance, or a story where you demonstrate leadership to increase performance of someone else. And the thing, I like about what you're saying with the so what, it starts with one concept, leadership. And it's sort of like it's simpler. Before we can tell a story that has cause and effect, leadership leads to, job performance. There's something more basic we have to get alignment on. It's, performance or even leadership by itself. These can be vacuous concepts. And once we get alignment on that, then we can move forward and tell the story or move to the how. And I just want to make two more points. I sort of view the starting with what as like, think of exercise. We work on our abs. That's the core. Think of, the what is the core. Upper body, we'll call that the why, and lower body, the how. But you start with the core. And once the core is strong, then you can move elsewhere. So to put this in a different example, let's say, we're talking about mentoring. In a sense, before I can tell a story about mentoring and really get someone into it, I have to make sure we both understand what mentoring is, so I could define it. Mentoring is helping someone become their better future self at work. Mentoring consists of 3 dimensions: role modeling, career support, and social support. If we both understand mentoring in the same way, when I tell a story, probably a higher chance it's going to land. That doesn't mean that you can still start with a story first to answer the why question, but there's a risk if we're not on the same page that I'm not going to appreciate the story. So I've always found, I think it's fascinating, you're bringing up this start with what, that, in most conversations, seems to be very important to start with the what, so we're grounded, then move to the why or how, and then we know we're on the same page, and it seems more practical. So I'm curious your reaction to some of those points, including ones I parroted back to you. Anything you want to expand upon there, or perhaps push back on?
This is for me. I agree with you, but it's also very challenging because performance is like you said. I think just separating out from what is a concept and what is the effect of the cause and effect, or what I would call the outcome, is quite tricky in itself. And I think that's probably what I'm seeing is I think you're absolutely right. You need to get what is your concept and is it understood? So a quick example on that is with a client that we work with, that you work with us with as well. They're in the project management space. So arguably their concept is project management. But actually, when you start to really dig into what they were about, actually their concept wasn't project management at all. It was actually project leadership. Just the nature of their business and what they do and who they do it for. So that had a profound difference to what we said. And the minute you then said, then you need to make it quite clear what is project leadership versus project management, because everyone was talking about project management. And then you then link that concept for them of project leadership to the outcome they delivered, the cause and effect of their why and their story. It came really, really powerful. Because they were adding value in all sorts of ways, which obviously was their effect that their competitors weren't. I'm probably not making this any easier for people listening, but I think it is quite complex, and it does take. And I'm probably, because I'm still trying to get my head around it myself. But I think where am I on it currently? I think you're right. I think you've got to be clear about what really is your concept. People need to understand what that concept is. And then you need to link it and hook it very, very clearly to the effect of your cause and effect, or the outcome you're going to achieve for the customer. If we were talking about this in a sales sense, for example, or for the individual, if we're talking about it from a leadership perspective. And I suppose my biggest observation is it's quite tricky, and maybe it's just because it's a new way of thinking for people. But what I'm already very clear about is when you land on it, it's incredibly powerful. Yeah. So I think where I am on this journey now is just trying to get much clearer on everything we just talked about, and get, I suppose, in many ways, just slicker at concept recognition, link into the effect or the why. And I think you're right. I think if you can, what I like about that is it's an attention grabber. It's a disturber if you're in a marketing space. And gets people's attention to want to listen to a story. The problem with a story is not everyone's got the bandwidth to listen to the story without, as you said, knowing, why am I listening to you? What's it even all about?
Right.
Is it even worth my time and attention? I know we didn't touch on metaphors, but metaphors obviously are useful for getting the what grounded as well. But I think that's, in a noisy, fast moving world, I think that's where it's really, really powerful.
With metaphors, you've mentioned before this client, sort of, project management is sort of a linear train. If there's like you shared with me before, if there's a stoppage, you can't get around it. Project leadership is you're like a captain of a ship. You can navigate around the icebergs, and it's more dynamic. But the point I want to come back to is, I think what you're bringing out here is, for me, the idea that the concepts, are the building blocks for the theory and the story. The theory that project leadership leads to some outcome, and a story about that. But related to that, if you don't understand what the building blocks are, you're not going to interpret the story or maybe the explanation of the theory in a way that really makes sense, right? To your point, you may hear a story that seems in the project management world, but because you don't really understand what project leadership is, you don't make the connection that that was an example of a project leadership story. It's just sort of a nice story that felt good, but it didn't hit home with that key concept. And I've seen this, again and again. Like if I'm working in sales, I'll talk about partnerships a lot. And I could tell a story that sort of illustrates me working in a partnership. And if it's a really, really good story, it's going to land no matter what. But I often like to set it up first by defining the concept of partnership. And I'll say, beyond financial considerations, I define partnership of giving of time, talent, and energy. Then I proceed to share a story that illustrates that. It helps them understand, the concept embedded in the story, helps them set up the listening. And, at the end of that, I can better get a sense and go back to the concept again and say, does that story make sense? Do you understand what I mean by partnership and giving of time, talent, and energy? And the prospect will say, yeah, I get it. Or maybe they say, I don't get it, or I don't buy what you're saying. But the interaction between the story and the concept is critical. If you only use one answer, if you only use a concept, you don't have the power of the emotional connection of the story and the cause and effect. If you only use a story, partially undefined concepts are embedded in it. So it's like you use both of these, and that triangulation causes insights. It causes influence.
Yeah, I agree. And I think something you just said that I wanted to pick up on that I think is probably the crux of where I'm really challenging myself at the moment is when you talked about your concept is that you talked about three elements. And I think you're right. I think when you really land on what is your concept and what is your what really, there are elements to it. And those elements ultimately become probably part of the theory of how you achieve the outcomes you achieve. Yeah. And that's something I think I'd never connected before. And so, I'm just in my own business, are we executive coaches? Are we consultants? Are we, trainers? And actually, I don't think we're any of those things. And, we're starting to look at concepts like unlocking potential and concepts like business improvement, because they actually have elements in them that when you add them all together, if you do successfully achieve the outcome that we say we can achieve for our clients. So, you think, from a branding perspective, this is really interesting because everyone's looking for their competitive advantage. And I think the biggest issue is they aren't really understanding what their concept really is, elements of their concept that are then going to enable them to show that when they lay all those elements together, they can achieve the outcomes they can achieve. Yeah, and I think that's where I'm really interested at the moment, because I think that's the bit that I've never really spotted before.
Yeah, it's like concepts can be defined and broken down into dimensions. Going back to mentoring, 3 dimensions: career support, social support, and role modeling. Now, each of those dimensions become targets for other answer types. So I could have stories for each of these. I can tell a mentee, let me tell you a career support story, a social support story, a role modeling story. You don't have to set it up so explicitly, but you share that story. All of a sudden they realize, wow, Brian's here to help me with, social support. Wow, I get it. So you can, target your stories, have them more broad or more pointed, and that's, really, helpful to influence someone, because there might be a specific dimension, specific type of story that's going to really land, and the best communicators are going to narrow it down as opposed to just being broad,
Yeah, absolutely. So it's I think this is probably, I think we've done enough with it with businesses at the sharp end to see that it's definitely an evolution from start with why. I think to start with why into start with what, linked to why is definitely an evolution that is working. We've seen without the scientific analysis that it makes a difference. It takes it to another level. It has more impact. It helps people to engage with it more easily. I think, from what you've just been saying, Brian, I think we're still just trying to get a bit more scientific on how we break it down and how we get to that place a bit more easily, for want of a better word, really.
Yeah, that's perfect. wonder if there's any final thoughts on this, Jason, before we move on to other aspects of our discussion.
Yeah, I think I sent you a document through a few days ago, and this might seem insignificant, but I think what's really interesting, when you're working with businesses and with individuals in those businesses on all sorts of things, more often than not, they don't really follow through on the things that you work on. hence why most businesses don't really significantly improve, grow, scale, whatever language you want to use. But I think what's been really interesting, if I look at how much post-engagement with Start With Why we've had versus Start With What linked to why, in almost every group I've worked with, they've gone away and they've actually physically done something and created something and brought it back to the room and said, okay, so clearly people innately are getting it more. It makes more sense to them, but on the subconscious, and it's driving them into some action. So that for me is just a fascinating insight more than anything else, which is kind of why I can see why this is definitely, I think this has more legs, and I think has got more legs to go in this whole space.
I think that's a great observation and point, and come back to the what is sort of the your midsection, your abs. If you understand, for example, what social support is, then you can implement it as the how. How are we going to increase social support for our employees? It's a natural transition from the concept to the procedures and the actions. Where stories are, one step removed from procedures and actions, you have the sort of middle layer of the what. So that's the link between why and how. So it makes total sense that if you focus on what, people have a clear understanding what the concept is, and then they're ready to implement it in terms of procedures and actions to make changes.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this recent interview. We hope you found it useful, and if you need more information on this subject, feel free to reach out to us here at the Directors Circle, or you can speak to one of our knowledge partners, Lucid, at lucid-group.com, who are accredited practitioners of all things AQ. Next episode, we'll be back with our usual knowledge partner interviews and special guests. So look out for that in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to Inside the Directors Circle.